Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for this dynamic panel discussion that we're going to have about T. Boone Pickens and his final courtroom battle. I'm Natalie Posgate, the senior litigation writer for the Texas Law Book. It's been a year to the day since we lost Pickens, who was one of the most legendary and interesting oil magnates of our time. He was well known in the 80s during his corporate raider days, but most of the outside world knew little about Pickens' persona in his final few years. But thanks to a major oil and gas trial that Pickens brought to a West Texas jury at the age of 88, today's panelists got to know him well in his final few years, which also resulted in a book about the legal tale. So today you're going to hear from oil and gas lawyer Krista Castañeda, who was Pickens's lead trial attorney and also the Democratic candidate for Texas Railroad Commission and co-author of The Last Trial of T. Boone Pickens. You're also going to hear from Lauren Steffi, the co-author of the book and writer-at-large for Texas Monthly. He is also the executive producer of Rational Middle Media and managing editor for 30 Point Strategies. We're also going to hear from veteran journalist Joe Nocera, who is a columnist for Bloomberg and got to know Pickens in his earlier years when he wrote a Texas Monthly cover story in the 80s about Boone's first big takeover attempt. And last but not least, we have trial lawyer Mike Lynn of Lynn Pinker Cox and Lynn Pinker Hirsch Schwegman. This event would not have been made possible without the firm's generous sponsorship. So I'm going to hand it over now to Mike, who is going to set the scene for Boone's last big courtroom battle.
Thank you, Natalie. Let me set the stage for this. T. Boone Pickens had been a stockholder advocate. If you're on one side of the docket, but of course, if you're on the other side, he was a green mailer. And he had his fair share of litigation with very white glove kinds of trial lawyers. But he rarely, if ever, actually tried a case before the one Krista and I tried for him. Now, trials, as far as I'm concerned, reveal character. They don't create it. Generally, the jury can see through the facades that are created by the partners and the parties, particularly in a large case. The case which is central to this presentation and the one Krista and Lauren Steffi wrote the book about began in the fall of 2016 and was tried for about 3 weeks in Pecos, Texas. We rented out of the motel. I guess we had 22 rooms we rented at the time that we were trying this case. Mesa, T. Boone Pickens company, alleged and proved that it had a contract to share the profits of a 65,000 acre AMI in Reeves County in what has become known as the Delaware Basin. It is an exceedingly rich field, with the U.S. Geological Survey finding that it is the largest oil find in the U.S., and some geologists believing that it has more oil in the Delaware Basin than all of Saudi Arabia. The shale base was thought to be, or is thought to be, 15,000 feet thick. To give you a comparison, the Bakkens in South Dakota has about 150 to 200 feet thick strata. Mesa's contract gave it a 15% share that could not be taken away unless Mesa agreed to that in writing. The allegation was that the other parties to the contract took it and failed to let him know they were taking it, let alone get his agreement. The defendant argued that a phone call overheard by another party, Mr. Pickens agreed, or at least waived his right to go forward with his rights in the 65,000 acre AMI. Thus, the issue became, did Mesa, through T. Boone Pickens, waive or agree to forego his rights in the AMI? The other side argued that T. Boone Pickens had every incentive to waive those rights because of the huge costs that the AMI would impose in developing the wells on the AMI. Gas prices had decreased, and according to the other side, T. Boone Pickens had lost or given away about $3 billion in the preceding few years, and he was in a severe cost-saving mode. T. Boone Pickens' story was that he viewed the AMI play as the best one he had ever participated in, and he refused to sign the papers sent to him to give up his rights. Thus, the case was really what is called an old-fashioned Texas swearing match between T. Boone Pickens and the person who listened in on the phone call. The party to whom T. Boone Pickens was speaking had passed away. As in all swearing match cases, the matter boiled down to whether either side could gain credibility with the jury, whether there was a tiebreaker, something in writing or a letter that was concrete enough to prove one side or the other was correct. We relied on T. Boone Pickens and his credibility, which was a double-edged sword. Pickens was larger than life, but at this stage of his life, he had a hard time seeing anything, and he could not hear well. He took the stand in his own defense, and Krista did a great job putting him on and wisely kept his direct to about 30 minutes or so. The other side chose to attack Mr. Pickens, claiming he was a man who was not accountable to anyone, and anyway, it was a bunch of rich guys fighting over a piece of land. They said that T. Boone Pickens was looking for an excuse to get back in the deal because, in any case, because he was broke. Pickens is the last man we intended to prove in the world to accuse of not being accountable. He had risked it all any number of times and won and lost his entire life and never offered an excuse. As for being broke, it was true that he had either given away or had spent about $3 billion in the previous few years. And as we argued, he was down to his mere last $1 billion. So what did the trial reveal about his character and the character of those who opposed him? And how did the lawyers deal with these issues in the small town of Pecos in trying this case? Well, that's why you're here. So let's get to it. Thank you very much.
All right, I'm Lauren Steffi. I'm the co-author of the book, and I'm also going to be moderating things today. The image on the screen behind me is actually the Reeves County Courthouse where all of this legal drama unfolded. It's in Pecos, in downtown Pecos. But I thought maybe, given the fact that this is the anniversary of Boone's death, it might be a good place to start with Krista, just having you talk a little bit about where you were when you learned of his death, and you have kind of an interesting theory about why he died on this particular day. So why don't you, we'll start with that.
Sure. Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming on and listening to our stories about the trial of T. Boone Pickens. So 1 year ago to the day, I was giving a presentation to a group at the Belo Mansion in Dallas for the Dallas Bar Association. And we were talking about the last trial of T. Boone Pickens, and we were actually talking about some other oil and gas related issues. And I had finished my presentation. I had a co-presenter and was sitting there when I got the Dallas Morning News text alert that said T. Boone Pickens had passed at age 91. And it still breaks me up. It broke me up then because even though he was a crusty old coot and a son of a bitch, he was also a really good friend. And I was so happy to have known him in his life. So anyway, that's where I was, and it was September 11th. And one of the very first thoughts that came to my mind is, ever a wizard with knowing how to message something, he picked the date. Of course, he would pick September 11th, the date that we all mourn the falling of, great icons in New York City, and a date that we always remember. It just struck me that he would pick September 11th as the date he would decide to depart this earth, because in part we would always remember him on this day. So that's my theory. I don't know if everybody shares it, but that's how I came to know the man.
Well, Joe, let's get a little perspective from you on who Boone Pickens was, because you really your reporting kind of spans his career. You sort of definitely knew him back in the early days. Talk a little bit about what he was like then, and what you saw later in life when you kind of reconnected with him.
Well, he was. I met him in 1982 February 1982, 4 months before he launched his first hostile takeover attempt at city service. And he could be funny, but he was very hard charging. He was very ambitious. And he had a thesis, which was that that we were going to run out of oil, and that the way you replenished your reserves was you had to get your reserves on Wall Street because they were going to be harder and harder to get out of the ground, and that replenishing reserves was the most important thing. He had a sort of second, thesis, of course, about shareholders, that shareholders own the companies, they needed to act like owners. He was going to lead the way, and of course, he and Carl Icahn and a few others became the original raiders, the swashbuckling. He had a lot of arrogance back then. He didn't know what he didn't know. As he got a little bit further into it, he started to feud with people in Amarillo, starting with the editor of the newspaper. I mean, he could be he and I actually had a falling out that lasted about 15 years when he fired me from ghostwriting his book. But then when I circled back and met him in his, sort of got reacquainted with him in his late 70s and early 80s, he was a different man. Still, wanted to win, still cared a lot about money as the way you kept score. But he had a humility that he hadn't had before, and he talked openly about his difficulty relationships with his children, and his bout with depression. And it was really unlike anything I'd ever heard from a CEO. So from that point on, our relationship became a lot sweeter and a lot healthier isn't the right word, but more productive, I would say.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I started covering Boone in about 1990, I guess, when they moved Mesa from Amarillo to Dallas. And, during that time, he was really struggling, and then ultimately lost control of the company,
Right.
Had to start over, went through that whole depression stage and everything else. But it was really interesting working on the book with Krista, because she kind of knew him later when he was sort of this different person, much more introspective. I remember interviewing him in about 2015 for another book I was doing. And, he was much more self-reflective about the mistakes he had made and that sort of thing. So there really was kind of a transformation that went on there.
I just quickly, it's very unusual for a top corporate executive to be reflective. I mean, part of the reason they're good at what they do is that they don't look back, they only look forward, and they don't sort of question themselves. And it was a really interesting experience listening to Boone talk about, losing Mesa and why the mistakes he made. And he talked, I mean, it's also unusual for a CEO to talk about the mistakes he made with his children and his family. And he was willing to do that as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Really interesting. Well, Krista, talk a little bit about how you came to represent him and how you sort of got drawn into this trial.
Yeah, so I'm going to back up 35 years myself. When I first came out of engineering school, I was a software programmer in the oil and gas industry. And one of my first assignments was working for Mesa Petroleum and writing report modules in COBOL for his MLP software. And while I never knew the man back then, it was interesting to me how many times our paths crossed over the years before it resulted in this last trial of T. Boone Pickens. Then after law school, I specialized in oil and gas litigation and was a partner in some of the AmLaw 100 firms. And Pickens came to be a client of mine at Lock Lord, where I had litigated a lease dispute where he had been cut out of a lease by Aubrey McClendon and Chesapeake, and I managed to get him a summary judgment on liability. And ever since that point in time, his general counsel kept in touch with me, and I took a hiatus from the law for a bit to go become a partner in what's known as the Brunswick Group, which is an international PR firm, and I was doing crisis litigation communications. We sat down and interviewed Pickens again, and frankly, that was the first time I ever met him in person, was during a 2014 interview where the senior partner of Brunswick Group, who was a former Wall Street Journal reporter, interviewed him for about 2 hours, and we did a focus piece on Pickens. And at the end of that, Pickens looked at me and he said, "Krista, we're going to find another lawsuit together." And I'm like, Mr. Pickens, I'm not a trial lawyer anymore. I'm doing this PR thing. And he said, "Krista, we're going to find another big lawsuit to try together." And I'm like, okay. And you know, again, I hadn't really sat down with the man until that point in time. And he was elderly even then, so in his mid 80s. And I thought, he's just not focused on, you know, what we're talking about right here. But by God, if he wasn't right, I stopped doing the PR thing because I missed the practice of law, formed my own law firm, decided I was going to strike out on my own. And within 6 weeks, his general counsel said, "Hey, we might have this small contract matter that we need for you to take a look at." And after about another 6 or 8 weeks of poking around, I said, "This is no small contract matter." By the end, we had claimed that we were due $1 billion. And so we set it up for trial. And then I brought in the great firm of Mike Lynn and his partners, and we tried the case. It's actually 5 weeks in Pecos, Texas. And by the way, that's Pecos, Texas behind my head. This is one of the pictures that Mike's paralegal Dee took of the landscape. And I actually think it's kind of pretty. For those who have never spent time out there, it was very enjoyable to be out there, even as we were engaged in a death battle with the other side.
Well, Mike, what did you think when Krista came to you with this case? I mean, you know, she was a solo practitioner. It was kind of unusual for someone in that position to have this large a case.
Well, we had already been involved through our appellate group, David Cole and Krista are friends, and they had worked a lot on a lot of the legal papers and briefing that had gone on. And if those of you that have a mind to do that, you should go back and read the briefing, because it was something in the neighborhood of over 300 pages, 350 pages. And it is some of the best written materials that you'll ever see in a state courthouse. And it was remarkable that Krista and this little group of people that Krista had assembled was able to pull this off and do this against some of the largest firms in the state of Texas. She was passionate about it. I had talked with her. I saw the trial and called her up and said, "Can we help you in it?" She said, "Not now." And then later on, she called me up and we began working together. I like working with Krista. She's a very strong woman. Those of you who know me, my wife's a judge, so this is not exactly hard for me to get used to having strong women to work with. And the trial was fun. I mean, I didn't want to tell T. Boone Pickens this, but I probably would have paid him to try the case because it was just. And I might add, if I wouldn't tell him that, because he would have accepted. But we had a ball. We rented 21 rooms out at the Swiss Chalet, and on this flat, barren landscape, looked like a moonscape to me when we got out there. My paralegal who took that picture brought her bicycle so she could ride in the mornings, and found out that the trucks would blow her over, so she decided that was not a good idea. And it was my general impression of T. Boone Pickens was this: he was about the same age as my father. My dad died; he passed away in 2006. But I saw in him some of those same characteristics. My dad was head of engineering at Bell Helicopter and head of research and development most of the time I was growing up out at Bell. and was as tough as a boot. And T. Boone Pickens was tough and loud and profane and difficult and did not want to be prepared for anything. And I thought that the way we handled, Krista loved T. Boone Pickens, as best I can tell. I watched T. Boone Pickens and thought this was a man who was really great, but he can't see, he can't hear, and he's in his last years. And our job is to win for him, but to win in a way so we can give him his dignity and not embarrass him. Because losing a swearing match case meant that T. Boone Pickens was a liar. And I just didn't want to have that day. So it was challenging but fun.
So I want to come back to this idea of Boone as a witness and what it took to sort of make that happen. But before we do that, Joe, tell us a little bit about his personality and what you saw in the years that you knew him, because I'm trying to set the stage for what it's going to be like to put this guy on the stand. So.
Well, I'm sure it would have been a lot different in 2018 or 2016 when this was tried than when I knew him at his. The problem putting him on the stand back in the 1980s was he would undoubtedly alienate the jury because he was so sure of himself and so sure he was right and so sure everybody else was an idiot. And he really was very contemptuous of corporate management, of, what he thought is the cronyism, he had this whole thesis that the problem with corporate America was that the executives were empire builders and they didn't care for the shareholders and yada, 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 yada. And you heard this constantly. He said it over and over and over and over and over. He told the same stories. But so I think, he was involved in a fair amount of litigation back then, although I don't think he ever had to go on the stand. And, he famously lost an important case against Chevron that really shut down his ability to go after these companies. And I think that was kind of a seminal moment in his life as a corporate raider.
Yeah. Well, so Krista, talk a little bit about what he was like as a client, what it took to get him ready. This was actually one of my favorite chapters, was prepping Pickens for the witness stand.
Well, not to take too much away from the thesis that he was a changed man in his later years, but he was always sure he was right. And he was always sure everybody else was an idiot, but he would listen to me on a few things. Although trying to prep him as a witness was the most challenging witness prep I've ever done. Pickens, and let me give this background too. Pickens was a master communicator. He worked long and hard and would talk to journalists and seek out publications over the decades where he could get his messages across. And he spent a lot of time and a lot of money learning how to communicate effectively. And perhaps part of his success in this trial was down to the fact he knew how to package himself a lot better than he did in the 1980s. He had his chief of communications, Jay Rosser, who's also in the book. And Jay worked really hard at helping Pickens burnish his legacy in a number of different ways. The Pickens plan for natural gas energy, BoonePickens.com, the Booneisms, the aphorisms that he would give us about various things, like in the trial, he'd say, "Don't rush the monkey," meaning let's not be in a big hurry to settle, because if you rush the monkey, you're going to miss out on the best part of the show. And so he was bound and determined to see it through. He had the courage of his convictions, even until the end, that he was right, they were wrong, and he was going to win. And I will tell you, I shared that conviction that we were going to win when I first picked up the case. And all we had to do was see it through a 5-week trial in Pecos, Texas, and it was going to be okay. But back to putting Pickens on the stand. I tried, and Mike tried numerous times to try to prepare him. So what you typically do is you will you know, sit down for a day and you'll talk about the concepts in the case and make sure they understand, you know, if you go this way, you're going to fall into this trap. If you go that way, you're going to, you know, present a better side of the story. Always, you know, the thing that you are bound by is the truth, but how you actually tell the story matters at trial. And so trying to get Pickens focused on how to tell the story and to be prepared for, you know, the holes that would come, such as what happened in this conversation that allegedly happened. Why didn't you check up on your part of this play that was worth so much money for 5 years? Why were you silent? I mean, those were some of the things that we had to face, and he just wouldn't have any of it. He was sure he knew how to message this. We'd try to cross-examine him over and over again, and at the end of the day, I put him on the stand without any real preparation because he wasn't going to sit for it. I think some of it was down to his physical infirmities, but mostly he just was sure he knew how to handle this jury, and he did.
You know, and I think that's an interesting point because, you know, back to what Joe said about how he would have alienated a jury back in the 80s. In this case, he really kind of won them over, both through little antics that he did, as well as, you know, his actual time on the stand with his testimony. I think there were a couple of places where, you know, the judge sort of admonished him, or the other side objected, and he, you know, actually acted like he, you know, didn't understand what was going on, or
Right.
whatever. I mean, it was I mean, there was, of course, the water bottle story. Why don't you tell that? That's one of my favorites.
Okay, so Pickens, this was his favorite trick, and I had seen it 15 times, and Mike probably saw it 10, where he'd take an empty, you know, water bottle, just one of those disposable water bottles that you get, you know, Ozarka in or whatever, and he'd stick it under his collar. It would be empty, and then he'd do this thing where he'd wrench his neck and push down on the water bottle and make this horrible noise, right? And everybody's like, oh my God, is that old man okay? Well, I had warned him, do not do that in the courtroom. Don't just, you sit there, you're in church. You pretend like you have nothing else to do than focus on the fact that we're all up at the bench yammering about some evidentiary point. And sure enough, it wasn't, I don't know, 3 days in, where he pulled this trick in front of the jury, and I hear it. Mike and I are stuck up at the front with 25 other lawyers, all packed in, arguing about some legal issue. And I hear this in back of me, and I knew right then and there he had disregarded mom's orders. He'd done that stupid trick, and the jury was cracking up. So he judged it right, but certainly it wasn't on advice of counsel.
Well, so one of the other things that was really kind of striking about this was the way the trial started. I mean, the judge was kind of ruling against you at every turn. And I think, Mike, at one point you said, we're zombies. The judge is going to shoot us in the head. What were you thinking at that point? I mean, beyond the zombie quote, but I mean, how were you thinking, you know, you needed to move forward at that point, or did you think it was just going to pretty much be over in a couple of days?
No. Well, you know, the dynamics of the trial are really interesting. We made a decision collectively to go in a swearing match case. Your choices are pretty limited. You have two people who are swearing to the lights red or the lights green, and there's a difference of opinion. So really, the fight is not what those people said, although you try to make it about that. It is about anything you can find that will be a tiebreaker that followed that. Anything like Krista said, waiting 5 years to do this, other documents and that sort of thing. So we called as adverse the first couple of witnesses. And the judge began ruling against us in ways that just didn't make sense, because he would rule for them on exactly the same issue, the same objections when I would make them, and rule against us on our on the things we were doing. And and generally when that happens, you're getting killed with the jury. But here what happened was really interesting, and this is one place where I sort of differ from the passages in the book, or my vantage was a little different, because I was watching the jury a lot while this was going on, wondering what they were saying and doing. That they began to wink at me, and they began to nod at me. And I thought that the judge turned into being somewhat helpful, because he antagonized the jury, because the questions I asked were the ones the jury wanted to have answered. about whether or not these actual written agreements said, for example, that you had to have something in writing in order to amend those doggone agreements. And they did say that. And they had very robust merger clauses so that oral deals didn't matter. And as we went forward, there was a fella in the middle of the first row, Hispanic, who wore sunglasses, hence his nickname that we ended up calling him, for lack of a better term, was Shades. So Shades would raise his glasses and wink at me when he saw the judge was going against me. So I thought, well, if this is working, we'll just play off against the judge. Now, in fairness to the judge, I think this was his first trial ever, and he had not tried anything for most of his life, and he certainly hadn't tried anything like this. So it was kind of like somebody had thrown him the keys to a 747 and said, go ahead and fly this thing. And on one side of the docket, he had some tall building lawyers from Houston, including some Sussman Godfrey lawyers were out there, and they had some Benson Elkin lawyers there, and Gardner Wynn lawyers there, and Bracewell lawyers there, and Yetter Coleman lawyers there. So, and then they had us on the other side. And I have a feeling that this was something that he had not actually wanted to do. And so his way of handling it was, I'm going to shut down anything they do that sounds like it's controversial. Well, you know, trial and cross, particularly at the front end of the case, is controversial. That's just the way it is. So yes, we had problems with the judge. And as far my comment about the zombie was later on and was really related to The Walking Dead. I said we were The Walking Dead because he made it very difficult to get our damage testimony in. Krista did a brilliant job of preparing different alternatives to our damages, is the way to put it. And we were able to finally get something in that worked out to 146 million bucks. But this case really was a $600 or $700 million case, and that jury would have given us 100% of that. They gave us 100% of our attorney's fees, for example. Right, Krista?
You are correct, and they gave us every dollar that I asked them for in close. So you're right. We would have gotten, I believe, if one can speculate, we would have gotten whatever we were permitted to ask them for. I just have a slightly different take on the judge, you know, and this is how vantage points at trial vary so much. You know, I thought he was doing his level best, and it was his first trial, and I mean, my God, what a complicated case to have as your first trial. And you know, the thing is that I think as judges grow in experience, they tend to let the lawyers try their case a bit more without so much guidance, just because at the end of the day, you can sort it out on post verdict motions, right? So I just think it was just a question of just such a unique circumstance for all of us involved.
Well, we ended up, I felt like we ended up liking one another. That's not to say that he was the easiest judge we've ever tried a case before, but he is, I do remember one time in the course of this, there's an objection called duplicitousness, or asking, I guess, 3 questions in one. So I asked whether something was fraudulent or something and unclear, and the records were messed up or something like that. So the other side objected, and he looked at me and smiled, because that is a stupid objection to make, because any decent trial lawyer will then break those into individual questions to go through. And he looked at me and smiled very largely. He knew that I was going to come back and ask each one of those questions separately. So I thought there ended up being some mutual respect, and I think it worked out pretty well. But I would not advise a judge who just takes the bench to start flying the 747. This is not the first case he should have tried.
I didn't even know 747s had keys.
Yeah, I'm not sure they do.
That's why I shouldn't fly one.
Let me just jump in here and mention that we're going to allow some time at the end for audience questions. So if you're listening and you want to ask a question, you can click on the Q&A button and put the question in. in the meantime, I wanted to talk a little bit about Boone's, I guess you'd say his constitution, his resiliency. One of the things that I thought was very interesting was that this case mattered enough to him that he sat through every day of the trial. He wanted to be there for it, even though, he was 88 years old. Now, he was a health nut most of his life. And, I think when he was in his 80s, he criticized Barack Obama's cardio workout and said, I can do better or something like that. So, I mean, obviously physically, up until the last few years, he was in great shape. But I think it also speaks to his determination, how something sort of stuck in his craw. And Joe, I'm wondering, I mean, you saw his personality in the 80s, but you also saw kind of the comeback that he made with the hedge fund. You made the point the other day that, he became a billionaire for the first time when he was in his 70s. Talk a little bit about that idea of him as sort of the comeback guy.
Lauren, I gotta ask Krista something first. Krista, you're
Okay.
a Democrat, right?
I am.
Okay, so how do you feel about Swift Boat?
I hate it. Okay,
Okay,
politics were a problem.
Right. So when I first met Boone, he knew me as a Yankee Democrat, and he was going to show me that Republicans could be good guys too, which I agree with. But the Swift Boat thing always drove me crazy, and whenever I would bring it up, he would say, "Well, nobody's ever proven that I was wrong. Everybody's proven that it was wrong." And he said, "I'll give $1 million to anybody who proves me that I'm wrong." And you'd say, "Boone, you were wrong." I mean, it's just, it's just clear. The record is clear. He wouldn't hear about it.
So Joe, just real quick on Swift Boat, I saw some inkling when we would discuss it that he knew he was wrong. He never said it out loud, but yeah, let's put it this way. I did not sense the same resolve as I describe in some of the chapters of my book when we would discuss that particular topic.
Well, I think that's partly because he turned against Bush in his second term. He hated the war, and so on. In terms of resilience, I mean,
I was just one more thing on that. He also patched things up with John Kerry because the Pickens plan, they actually set aside the differences and worked together on some of the environmental stuff. So.
It's so interesting. So Swift Boat drove me crazy. But, I worked at the New York Times for a long time. And Boone was my friend during most of that time. And when the Pickens plan came along, my colleagues at the Times in the business section would say, "Oh, he's just talking his own book. That his only motive for the Pickens plan was because it would put money in his pocket." And, you couldn't, to me, he believed in natural gas with every fiber of his being. It went way beyond dollars and cents. He spent his whole life betting on natural gas. And you'd say, no, this is a genuine act of patriotism by somebody who thinks it would help the country and would like to see us stop importing foreign oil and so on and so forth. And you just couldn't convince people, the sophisticates, the coastal elites, as we call them now, that someone like Boone could have a motive that went beyond dollars and cents.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean,
and Lauren, my own view on that is that what Pickens really wanted to do was be in the mix of what mattered, and that money was just a way of keeping score as to whether he was in the mix of what mattered. But I think he was more focused on making an impact, however he was going to make an impact, than the dollars and cents.
Yeah, he, when he was younger, he definitely looked over his shoulder at other CEOs who made more money, and it definitely bothered him that he was not in the top tier of money-making CEOs. And then, of course, the hedge fund made him very, very, very rich in the 70s and 80s, and he seemed, obviously he wasn't looking over his shoulder again, but somehow it didn't mean he stopped being as obsessed with money as he had been when he was younger. And I think that this trial really did not have to do with 146 or 148 million dollars. It really had to do with, you know, I don't let people screw me. No matter, that is not something I will ever let happen. And I think, you know, I'm not gonna look the other way just because I'm rich and I'm old. You're not allowed to do that to me.
Joe, we had that discussion. I had that discussion with the other lawyers, and during breaks, I said, why would your guys pick T. Boone Pickens to try to cheat? You know, anybody else, okay. But why would you pick T. Boone Pickens? Because you know that he will go to the mat and he's not going to settle this case. And Krista and I had a settlement discussion with those guys over at the Pecos, and without getting into too much detail, they were telling me how they were going to win and how our case wasn't worth shit, and our chicken shit, basically. And my response was one I learned a long time ago: is you just don't know the value of chicken shit in Pecos. And we had this discussion. I said, look, folks, I don't know what the judge is going to do. I have no idea what the jury's going to do, but the jury likes us. They like us. They like Krista. They like me. They're winking at us. They're waving at us, and they don't like you guys. And they didn't take my warning at that time. But T-Boone, let me say something about being wealthy and looking over his shoulder. In interview, when you first get into a case like this and you're talking to somebody that is like T. Boone Pickens, you try to start at the very beginning. I'm sure you do that in your interviews. He started off with a pregnant wife, finishing college with about $5,000. Was it $500? I think it was.
No, he had $1,500.
$1,500, and he drove with a pregnant wife, no air conditioning, to Oklahoma and started a job the next day. And this is a guy. If Joe, I don't know if you've been out in those fields at all, but it is hot, and the steel will burn your hands and burn your cheek as you're carrying it around, and it's cold. Your hands and your face stick on the metal, and he was out there doing that work for the longest time before he started getting pieces of the action and starting to make some money. So, sure, he's a poor guy who basically made good. He's a good, solid Texas icon.
That's right.
So before we get too much further away from it, one of the questions we have from the audience is if we could explain the Swift boat controversy a little bit more. Joe, you want to give some background on that?
Sure. When John Kerry was running for president, there were a group of men who claimed to have been, he was a war hero, and there were a Vietnam War hero, and there were a group of men who claimed that the story of the Swift boat, which I don't recall exactly, was basically made up, and that they knew the real story, and that Kerry was not a hero. And Boone was their largest financer. He put up, I believe, $500,000, and they were able to put ads on television and spread their message, and it definitely hurt Kerry, no question about it. And so the question, and this has always been viewed by Democrats as a kind of dirty trick, as a something that was just made up out of whole cloth to damage Kerry. So Boone eventually, after he'd heard this enough, said, I will give $1 million to anyone who can prove to me that I'm wrong, that the Swift boat guys are wrong. And he, as long as I knew him anyway, never paid out the money and never acknowledged that he had been wrong.
Okay. Let's see. We got another question here. I'm not sure who wants to take this one, but describe his relationship with his family.
Yeah, I'll take that. It was tough. His older kids, his kids from his first marriage, 2 boys, 2 girls, always felt that he had basically abandoned them for his work because he was always on the road, and he let his wife Lynn carry the ball, basically raise the kids herself. As they grew older his daughters were hot and cold on him over time, and one of his sons was incredibly troubled, and Boone eventually said, "I can't keep funding you or helping you or bailing you out." The other son kind of went his own way and wanted to prove that he could out Boone, which he really couldn't. Boone always had a fantastic relationship with all his grandkids, no matter what his relationship was with their parents. And the grandkids spent a lot of time at the ranch. And the one daughter that he's always been close to his entire life was his daughter Liz, who was adopted, and who he adopted when he married B. Pickens, his second wife. And so let me just say one other quick thing. So after the Depression, he decided that it would be worth it to go into therapy with his kids. Some of them said yes, some of them said no, but I know he did have a fair number of therapy sessions with his children, which is the tough thing for a guy in his 70s to do, when the daughters are in their 50s.
You know, he was close to his daughters as he grew older, and he likened me when so there's that scene in the first of the book where he and I are arguing, and for, I don't know, 3 minutes or so, it looks like I'm going to get fired, even as we're, in the middle of trial, which of course I knew I wasn't going to get fired. But anyway, he likened me to one of his daughters afterwards, who he said was the only one that could argue with him and stand up to him, even as he was apologizing to me. And he could apologize. I learned that.
Well, he could,
Yeah,
and I found that out. I found that out after 15 years of not having a relationship with him. When I was at Fortune and I wrote something about shareholders and shareholder value, and he just sent me a note, out of the blue, saying, "I really like the work you're doing, and keep it." That was all it said, but it was obviously an attempt to kiss and make up, which I did.
It was interesting, Krista talked about how he dealt with reporters and he would reach out to reporters, but that was always a bit of a rocky relationship. I know in my own experience, as Jay Rosser once told me, I was in and out of the doghouse so many times he lost track of where I was. He would hold a grudge if he didn't like a story, and that got better in later years too. But certainly in the early days, there's a lot of stories out there about, he marked up newspapers and sent them back to reporters and things like that. So it really was, it was challenging sometimes,
but he held grudges. He held grudges against competitors. He held grudges against employees. I mean, that was one of the things that really marked him when he was in his 50s and 60s, and that he kind of lost or let go of when he hit his 70s and 80s.
Yeah. So one other question here is about his donations. He obviously, I think he liked to say that, what was it, Mike? He'd made $4 billion. He lost 2, he gave away 1, and then he still had 1 left. Wasn't that what he said during the trial?
Yeah, he said he was down to his last billion, which made the jury laugh.
But of course, a big chunk of that billion that he gave away went to Oklahoma State, where his name's on the stadium. I think he gave about $600 million all into the school. What about Chris? You probably recall some other causes that he supported and whatnot.
Oh yeah, I mean, he's got his name all over buildings, throughout Dallas and Houston. He was big into, health-related charities, Center for Brain Health, a hospice, has his name on the downtown YMCA here in Dallas, and his picture as being a young basketball player is up in the hallway, and so he gave to a lot of charities over the years. He was very generous with his money, and I think he liked. I think he really liked being a philanthropist.
I once asked him why he spent so much money on Oklahoma's OSU sports. When you get right down to it, he spent about $300 million just on sports. And he said, well, Joe, it's the only thing I can change while I'm still alive.
Well, he spent his freshman year in college at my alma mater, Texas A&M. He got there on a basketball scholarship, and he didn't make the team. So at the end of his freshman year, they didn't renew the scholarship. So he transferred to OSU. And, I don't know what A&M saved on that scholarship, but it's probably one of the worst business decisions ever, because he wound up giving so much to OSU. But well, let's kind of go around the horn and talk a little bit about his legacy, or sort of favorite Pickens stories, and just to kind of over the next 3-4 minutes. Joe, you want to start?
Pickens stories?
Yeah, or what you think his legacy will be.
I'm going to tell you one. The last time I saw him, my wife and kid and I went to the ranch, and he was in pretty bad shape. Not just the use of the walker and everything, but he was having trouble finishing a sentence, and sometimes he'd seem to be off into outer space, and you could tell the end was approaching. So then, he said he asked me to come into the conference room in the ranch. And if you've been there, you see that the whole wall is a geological map of his ranch, with the wells, where the wells are and everything. And then he called in his geologist. I didn't really realize until then that he had a full-time on-staff geologist, but he does. And for the next 10 minutes, he was absolutely alert, alive, aware, speaking in perfect paragraphs, because this was his thing. This was his, and talking about where they were going to drill next, and and what the formations were, and why you get this kind of oil and not that kind of oil. And it was just sort of amazing to watch him switch it on when he got into the subject of oil and gas, which really has been, his whole life.
Yeah, he was amazing with numbers. I remember a couple of years before he died, I was talking with him. We were having lunch in his office with Jay Rosser and some other people. And we got talking about old West Texas ranches, and I mentioned a time that Rosser and I had gone to the Matador Ranch in West Texas, and he immediately said, "Oh, the Matador, they've got, I don't know, 130,000 acres, whatever it was." And I said, I honestly don't remember. We Googled it, and sure enough, he was like spot on. I mean, his ability to pull numbers out always amazed me. But I'm sorry, Krista, your favorite story.
Oh, there were so many great stories. And in fact, one of our questions in the chat is are the movie rights sold? And the answer is no. So if you know somebody who wants to make this into a movie, just call, please, because I think it would make a great movie. And I think there are so many Pickens stories you could weave into this. I'm going to tell the one of really kind of the last time I saw him. He would always gather us around this giant conference room table he had in his office. It seated about, I think, 30 or 40 people. Huge wood inlaid, and at one end was all of his TVs showing the markets, right? So there'd be this entire wall of screens, and another wall was all of his geology maps where he was drilling for oil. And anyway, he gathered us in. I would come in for lunch every couple of weeks or every month or so after the trial. And he loved to recount the stories from the trial. He just absolutely loved it. And he would love it when, he'd be able to talk about, and remember that time when the lawyer asked me, well, are you doing okay, Mr. Pickens? And I said, well, I'm okay, but I'm a little worried about you, Jeff, because the lawyer looked a little out of his sorts at that point in time, because he'd been cross-examining for a while. Anyway, Pickens loved to recount the war stories from this trial, but this particular meeting, we had a discussion about the fact that I was thinking about running for Texas Railroad Commission. He said, well, Krista, you should do that, and it's just a short step from railroad commissioner to the president. And I said, well, Mr. Pickens, are you going to vote for me for president? Of course, he's never voted for a Democrat ever. And he said, well, I just might. And all of his handlers, all of his right-hand men are like, oh, no, we're not saying that. That's never happened. And of course, he probably wouldn't have had he still been alive and able to vote. But anyway, and nor am I running for president, by the way. I think it was part of the crowd of the last year when we had 25 Democrats running for president, and he just thought, well, why not? What's one more? But that particular time, he was very infirm. He couldn't really stand up well. There was a time where I actually had to catch him because he was falling over backwards. He'd lost quite a bit of weight, and he couldn't speak very well, but he did stand up on his own. He wanted to show us he could walk out of the room, and he said, all right, I'm leaving, and I want you to know that I love you all. And he walked out of the room, and of course he was, he wasn't making it clear whether he was leaving for his doctor's appointment or whether he was leaving the planet, but he left the planet just a few weeks later.
All right, Mike, any closing thoughts?
Well, I guess the original question is any scenes that you remember. The scene I remember from the trial was when he was being crossed, and there was a period when remember he's on the stand and he can't see all that well, and he can't hear. He has a iPad with a Bluetooth connection to his earplugs. And, cross is confusing anyway, but if you can't see and can't hear and you just hear noise, there was an argument that ensued between Krista and the other side, I think Tim, and I was watching him throughout that, and he became very, very distressed that he couldn't follow it, that he wanted to be in control of it. And I kept thinking, this guy in his 40s or 50s must have just dominated people, because here he is in a place where he's under attack, and he's hearing these arguments, and he wants to take charge of the room, but he doesn't know how. And he became very, very frustrated, obviously, on the stand. Second thing is, the jury really respected him for showing up in the infirm condition he was in and taking the stand and saying, this is what happened, by God, and I should win. I think they felt as if he respected them by doing that. I might add, the other guy that was going to testify against him did not show up and testified by way of deposition, by video. So I just thought he was a brave guy when he took the stand.
I have one question. Has money ever changed hands from the defense to the plaintiffs?
The case was settled for a confidential amount post-judgment.
Oh, all right. So you did okay. So you got 145 instead of 146. Okay, I got it.
I'm allowed to say the case was settled for a confidential amount post-judgment.
Yes,
I'm reminded of Steve Sussman's story where he said, I cannot tell you how much I settled the case for, but I took everybody to Tahiti for a vacation.
Where's
there's one other
my
question.
Vacation?
There's one other question here I didn't want to overlook. They're asking if the Mesa Vista Ranch, that's Boone's ranch in West Texas, has been sold. It has not. It's still on the market for a mere $250 million. And Boone told me that, it costs $5 million a year to operate it. So, if you've got some extra cash, it's a good deal. All right, so let me just say, if you want any more information on the book, the website is lasttrialoftboonepickens.com. And with that, I will turn it back to Natalie to wrap things up.
Or not.
Or not.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists today. Be on the lookout for a replay of this program in your inbox. And that's all I have. So thank you so much, everybody.
Bye-bye.
So long.
Thanks, everyone.